The water burns like ice against her skin. Ophelia's breath stutters as the brook closes over her shoulders. Her fingers, already numb, slide from the willow branch. In the distance, church bells mark the hour. Laughter drifts from the castle windows, soft, cruel, oblivious. Cold seeps through her bones as her dress swells around her, a silken shroud. Was it truly madness that brought her here? Or was she silenced? This is the Pandoras project. The seals are breaking. Even if you've never read Shakespeare's Hamlet, you know her image, a young woman lost in water and flowers, painted, sung, and mythologized for centuries. Recently, even global pop star Taylor Swift released a song called The Fate of Ophelia, reimagining how the story might have ended if Ophelia had been rescued instead of drowned. But Shakespeare's Ophelia was not saved. She was abandoned, a girl whose story was told by the very people who destroyed her. Why has her death been turned into beauty for generations? What if every romantic image hides a calculated murder? What if her madness was manufactured by the very men who claim to love her? Subscribe and stay as we crack open the tombs history tried to seal. Because Ophelia's murder was just the beginning. 400 years of lies are about to break open. Part 1. The Perfect Storm. Ophelia was groomed into the perfect victim long before her body touched that water. At 20, she existed in a cage built by loving hands that felt more possessive each day. Her father Polonius, the king's chief advisor, didn't just guide her, he conditioned her to crave his approval like oxygen. Every decision required his blessing. Every thought needed his validation. "You are my pride, my jewel," he would tell her, his hand heavy on her shoulder. "Don't speak unless spoken to." His hand on her shoulder during their talks, protective or possessive. The weight feels heavier each time. How many modern Ophelias do we create every day? Whose reality is manufactured by the voices claiming to guide them? Polonius constructed her prison using love-bombing techniques perfected by predators. When she obeyed his commands without question, he showered her with praise, calling her his precious daughter, his pride. When she showed the slightest independence, he withdrew that warmth like pulling away sunlight. Her emotional survival became dependent on reading his moods, anticipating his needs, becoming what he required her to be. They systematically isolated her from female allies who might recognize the patterns. No close friendships with other court ladies. No confidants who could reflect back her reality. No mother to model resistance or independence. She was surrounded by men who claimed to know what was best for her while slowly erasing her ability to know what was best for herself. Her brother Laertes added the next layer of conditioning before departing for France. He cornered her in empty corridors where no one could witness his programming sessions. The prince could never marry beneath his station, he warned, his voice heavy with manufactured concern. Royal blood demanded royal matches. Her love was naive. Her hopes were childish fantasies that would only bring shame to their family name. But Laertes wasn't just offering brotherly advice. He was installing fail-safes in her psyche. Every time she felt hope about Prince Hamlet, Laertes' voice would whisper doubts. Every moment of happiness would be poisoned by his warnings about her unworthiness. He believed he was protecting her. In reality, he was programming her for self-destruction. Hamlet's manipulation cut deepest because it weaponized genuine intimacy. He had loved her once, learned her vulnerabilities during tender moments, discovered exactly where her emotional arteries ran closest to the surface. When madness infected his mind, real or performed, he used that anatomical knowledge of her heart to inflict maximum psychological damage. You know this pattern. You've seen it in families where love becomes leverage, in relationships where intimacy becomes ammunition. Who benefits when a woman's emotional responses become evidence of her instability? Who profits when her truth gets labeled as overwrought drama? We've seen the trap being built, but the betrayal that turned her world upside down is still ahead. A faint choir hums in the chapel. Pages of a prayer book flutter as if caught by unseen breath. Part 2. The betrayal everyone missed. The psychological warfare reached its peak when Polonius recruited his daughter as unwilling spy. The plan was surgical in its violation, using her love as surveillance equipment. Ophelia would approach Hamlet while reading devotional texts, projecting innocence and piety that had been carefully rehearsed. Her father and the king would hide nearby, voyeurs to an intimate betrayal they had orchestrated. She had no choice, and that was the design. Refuse her father and face the complete withdrawal of love that had become her life support. Betray Hamlet and shatter the last authentic connection to her own heart. The trap was perfect, because every option led to her psychological annihilation. Candle smoke drifted through the corridor. Somewhere, a lute string snapped. When the moment arrived, Hamlet sensed the deception before she spoke her first coached line. His eyes found the hiding places where her father and the king crouched like predators. His response was calculated theater designed to destroy her publicly while sending messages to his hidden audience. "Get thee to a nunnery," he commanded, his voice carrying across the chamber like a sexual assault disguised as moral instruction. "You are corrupt. You will spread that corruption to others. Better to lock yourself away than infect the world with your poison." But there was something more sinister in his words. Hamlet knew her body, had touched her skin, had whispered against her neck during stolen moments. Now he weaponized that intimate knowledge. Every private confession became public ammunition. Every tender moment became torture material designed to humiliate her in front of the men who were using her. You witnessed this, didn't you? You watched a young woman absorb psychological and sexual violation while standing perfectly still, her face revealing nothing, her soul disintegrating in real time. Did you wonder why no one intervened? Did you ask yourself who benefits when love becomes a weapon of intimate destruction? Each word was chosen for maximum devastation. "I loved you not," he announced, erasing their history with surgical precision. The intimacy they had shared, kisses, touches, whispered promises, all became evidence of her worthlessness. Cold air filled the spaces where warm breath should have been. Every place he had touched her now felt contaminated. Her own skin became evidence of her corruption in his twisted testimony. But something shifted during that confrontation. Hamlet's cruelty crossed from strategic into sadistic sexual torture. He began enjoying her pain, feeding on her helplessness like a predator discovering the perfect victim. The power to destroy someone who had trusted him with her body became intoxicating. His madness, real or performed, found perfect satisfaction in her institutional sexual and emotional annihilation. Ophelia left that encounter fundamentally violated. The man who had touched her with love had publicly declared her body evidence of corruption. Her father had used her intimate feelings as bait. The king had watched her sexual humiliation like pornographic entertainment. She was alone in a court full of people who saw her only as an object for their psychological and sexual games. Her isolation complete, her death became inevitable. Now we'll witness how they used her love as the ultimate weapon against her. Part 3. The Final Blow. Behind a tapestry, Polonius eavesdropped on Hamlet's confrontation with Queen Gertrude. When the prince heard movement in the shadows, he drove his sword through the fabric without hesitation. Polonius died instantly, his blood soaking through expensive cloth. For Hamlet, it was almost an afterthought. For Ophelia, it was the moment her reality completely fragmented. Her father's death wasn't just loss, it was the shattering of her last anchor to a coherent sense of self. Polonius died because he was spying. Hamlet killed him without knowing whose life he was taking. Ophelia realized she had been bait in a trap that consumed the one person she was conditioned to obey above all others. What the court diagnosed as madness was actually complete psychological fragmentation, the only response left to a mind systematically destroyed by everyone she had trusted. When Ophelia appeared before them singing broken songs and distributing flowers with trembling hands, she wasn't insane. She was a fractured consciousness, trying to communicate truth through the only language they couldn't officially silence. Colors became too bright, sounds too sharp. She watched herself from outside her body, observing this broken girl who used to be called Ophelia. "Ophelia is gone," she whispers to her reflection. "Only the flowers remember who she was." Her songs contained coded testimony that the court dismissed as ravings. She sang about false promises and young men who violated then abandoned women, direct evidence against Hamlet's sexual and emotional abuse. She sang about fathers who died suddenly and daughters left defenseless, testimony about Polonius's death and her complete abandonment. The court heard meaningless fragments. She was delivering a criminal testimony from a mind that could only process trauma in pieces. The flowers she distributed were exhibits from a trial that would never be held. Rosemary for remembrance. How many women must be remembered only in death, their voices silenced until martyrdom makes them safe to honor? Pansies for thoughts, the thoughts she was never allowed to speak while her mind was intact. Fennel for flattery and deceit, handed directly to those who had groomed her while planning her destruction. Columbines for foolishness, mocking those who thought her too naive to understand their sexual and psychological games. Rue for sorrow and repentance went to Queen Gertrude, the woman who watched other women suffer sexual and emotional abuse and said nothing. Each flower was evidence of specific crimes against her body and mind, violations that would never be prosecuted, abuse that would never be acknowledged. Her dissociation wasn't madness, it was survival. When reality became too painful to inhabit, she floated above it, watching this broken girl distribute evidence of her systematic destruction. The fragmentation wasn't mental illness, it was her psyche protecting itself from complete annihilation. This wasn't the first time Shakespeare documented female psychological murder. Lady Macbeth's sleepwalking scenes show another woman driven to fragmentation by male violence. Desdemona's willow song before Othello murders her reveals another victim trying to process intimate betrayal. Cordelia's silence that gets her banished demonstrates another woman punished for refusing to perform love on command. Shakespeare wrote a catalog of women systematically destroyed by the men who claim to love them. Each one speaks truth through psychological fragmentation. Each one gets labeled mad, hysterical, or disobedient. Each one dies while the men who destroyed them live to tell sanitized versions of their murders. How many modern women distribute invisible flowers, speaking truth through psychological fragmentation in languages we refuse to translate because acknowledging them would require us to see the systematic abuse we've normalized? Her madness decoded as testimony, but her death? That's where the real murder happened. The evidence points to something far darker than suicide. If her madness was testimony, then her death became propaganda. Part 4. The Impossible Witness. Listen carefully to Queen Gertrude's account of Ophelia's drowning and ask yourself, who speaks like this about watching someone die? Gertrude claims she witnessed Ophelia climb a willow tree over a brook, fall when the branch broke, and drown while singing and floating among flowers like some medieval fairy tale. She describes the scene with impossible poetic precision. Ophelia's garments spreading wide and bearing her up temporarily like a mermaid's tail before the weight dragged her down to muddy death. No one watching a person drown speaks in beautiful verse about their final moments. No one observes someone drowning and later recounts it as romantic poetry suitable for court entertainment. Gertrude's account reads like prepared fiction designed to cover institutional erasure. The details reveal not just lies, but complicit predation. If Gertrude truly witnessed this drowning, why didn't she attempt rescue? She was close enough to observe flower petals and fabric movements, close enough to note the specific songs Ophelia sang while dying. She was close enough to save a life. But here's the terrifying truth. Gertrude had a rope. She chose poetry over rescue. A raven cawed in the distance. Court musicians tuned their instruments for evening entertainment. Think about it. Who benefits from the beautiful death of an inconvenient witness? Who profits when murder gets reframed as romantic tragedy that people will paint and admire for centuries? Gertrude wasn't just a passive witness. She was a complicit predator who watched a young woman drown while composing the beautiful lies she would tell afterward. Every poetic detail was calculated to transform murder into art, evidence into entertainment. Multiple cover-up layers reveal ritualized silencing protocols. The coroner ruled the death accidental rather than suicide, despite clear evidence of intentional drowning. The church provided full funeral rites despite religious laws forbidding suicide victims' Christian burial. The royal family attended the ceremony despite court protocol around disgraced nobles. This pattern wasn't uncommon in Elizabethan England. It was cultural disappearance mechanism. Court records from 1592 document Lady Frances Howard, whose inconvenient knowledge about court affairs resulted in her sudden death, ruled accidental, despite evidence of systematic poisoning. In 1598, Margaret Clifford died under suspicious circumstances after threatening to expose corruption in Queen Elizabeth's inner circle. Official cause: melancholy madness leading to accidental drowning. Water in her lungs, lies in her throat, both placed there by people who had sworn to protect her. Even the gravediggers whisper about the institutional nature of these convenient verdicts. If Ophelia had been born common, they note, her death would have been ruled suicide regardless of evidence. Social rank purchased not just convenient verdicts, but entire institutional conspiracies to eliminate inconvenient women while preserving their own reputations. You've seen this before, haven't you? How often do powerful families receive different justice than ordinary people? How frequently do inconvenient deaths get explained away as mental health tragedies, while the real perpetrators attend the funerals as grieving loved ones? Every 6 minutes, a woman dies from domestic violence. How many were called unstable, dramatic, or mentally ill before their deaths? How many beautiful obituaries hide institutional erasure? How many funeral attendees are actually celebrating the successful silencing of inconvenient testimony? The impossible witness exposed, but Shakespeare hid one more secret in plain sight. What he knew about this pattern will change how you see every beautiful death in history. The water stills. The court fades. Only paintings remain, frozen, framed lies. Final part. The pattern revealed. We've uncovered her systematic grooming, the intimate violations disguised as love, the psychological fragmentation they called madness, and the institutional conspiracy that covered up her elimination. Now it's time to see how Shakespeare used this tragedy to warn us about civilizational complicity in female genocide. Shakespeare's original audience understood these implications because they lived within systems that routinely eliminated inconvenient women. Elizabethan playgoers recognized state-sanctioned abuse disguised as masculine protection. They had witnessed women's deaths conveniently solving political problems while society celebrated the beautiful corpses. They saw through romantic interpretations to identify the calculated cultural murder underneath Ophelia's drowning. But something calculated and sinister happened over the following centuries. Victorian romantics didn't just transform Ophelia's murder into a tragic love story, they created a ritual of erasure. They painted her drowning as beautiful surrender rather than institutional elimination. Pre-Raphaelite artists depicted her floating among flowers like a sleeping beauty rather than a young woman driven to death by coordinated state violence. The romanticization served a specific purpose in systems of ornamental death. Instead of seeing Ophelia as a victim of ritualized silencing, audiences learned to see her as a romantic figure who died for love. Her story became safe, beautiful, and completely unthreatening to existing power structures that continued eliminating inconvenient women while celebrating their beautiful corpses. Modern psychological analysis confirms what Shakespeare's audience instinctively knew. Ophelia displays textbook symptoms of complex trauma resulting from coordinated institutional abuse. Her death fits the psychological profile of someone systematically destroyed by organized civilizational warfare against female testimony. But here's the apocalyptic revelation. We've been consuming victim pornography for 400 years while calling it culture. Every romantic Ophelia painting is a murder scene being celebrated. Every museum that displays these works is housing crime scene documentation while visitors admire the artistry of female elimination. The men around Ophelia didn't just destroy one woman. They perfected state-sanctioned disappearance protocols that civilizations have been replicating ever since. When she finally shattered, they didn't just call it madness. They created cultural mythology that would protect future perpetrators by teaching society to find female elimination beautiful when properly presented. How many modern Ophelias are drowning right now while we call it love? Whose elimination do we witness daily while labeling it mental health crisis, relationship drama, or tragic accident? Ophelia's story wasn't unique. It was the blueprint for civilizational genocide. But the pattern extends far beyond Shakespeare. Gabby Petito, labeled dramatic while being systematically eliminated. Amber Heard, called attention-seeking while documenting abuse. Countless women whose truth gets labeled emotional instability while they're literally being murdered by the systems claiming to protect them. Every time someone calls Ophelia's story romantic, they participate in covering up a 400-year-old ritual of erasure. Every beautiful painting of her drowning erases the institutional violence that put her in that water. Comment below which system of ornamental death we should expose next. Like this video if you'll never see beautiful deaths the same way again. Subscribe to the Pandoras Project, because the truth about Ophelia was just the beginning of what civilizations have hidden through cultural mythology. Remember Ophelia not as a romantic tragedy, but as documentation of ritualized silencing perfected by institutional power structures. Her death wasn't beautiful. It was genocide. And Shakespeare made sure the evidence survived 4 centuries of coordinated cultural cover-up designed to make future eliminations easier to execute and more beautiful to observe. The truth was always there in the water, waiting for someone brave enough to reach in and pull out the evidence of civilizational complicity in female genocide.